Welcome to Mystery Cafe, your ultimate stop for gripping detective stories, chilling mysteries, and unforgettable investigations. Here, every video serves a fresh dose of suspense, shocking twists, and cases that challenge your inner detective. From classic whodunits to modern crime stories, we bring the world of mystery straight to your screen, where every clue matters and no secret stays buried for long. Before we start unraveling today's mystery, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa. Drop your country, city, or stay in the comments, and let's see how far the Mystery Cafe family reaches. Magnifying glass tilted right.
The Poisoned Pen. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Manuscript. Jessica Fletcher was no stranger to literary events, but Lancaster was different. Nestled in the charming hills of New England, the small town was home to the prestigious Lancaster Literary Society, an institution that brought together authors, editors, and readers from around the country. This weekend, it was the host of a special writing seminar, and Jessica, as the guest of honor, had been invited to lecture on the fine art of crafting mysteries. The evening air was crisp as Jessica stepped out of her cab, the scent of autumn leaves lingering in the air. The mansion that housed the Literary Society was an imposing structure, its ivy-covered walls stretching towards the sky and its windows glowing with the soft golden hue of candlelight. She adjusted her coat and made her way up the steps, her heels clicking against the stone, creating a rhythm that matched her anticipation. Inside, the grand foyer was filled with chatter and the clink of glasses as guests mingled. The walls were adorned with old portraits of literary greats, their eyes seemingly following Jessica as she moved through the room. She made her way to the refreshment table, where she was greeted by Eleanor Greenfield, the event's organizer. Eleanor was a woman in her early 50s, with an air of authority about her that was both welcoming and intimidating. Her sharp eyes gleamed as she extended her hand. "Miss Fletcher, what an honor to have you here," Eleanor said, her voice warm but tinged with a note of excitement. "I've read all your books, of course. You've inspired so many writers, including myself." Jessica smiled graciously, shaking Eleanor's hand. "Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've heard so much about the Literary Society. It's a lovely setting for a weekend of storytelling." Eleanor nodded, her eyes scanning the room as if taking inventory. "We're thrilled to have you. It's been a long time since we've hosted someone with such acclaim. I'm sure the attendees will be eager to hear your insights." Jessica glanced around, noticing the eclectic mix of people. Some were seasoned authors, while others were budding writers eager to break into the literary world. A few familiar faces from the publishing world were scattered about, their presence adding an air of professionalism to the otherwise casual gathering. Eleanor led Jessica to a table near the center of the room, where a small group had gathered around a man with a confident smile and a sharp suit. His name was Howard Trent, and he was introduced to Jessica as one of the Society's prominent guests. Howard was a successful author of historical thrillers with a reputation for best-selling novels that had captivated readers across the country. He was in his mid-40s with strikingly good looks and an air of arrogance that came with his fame. "I've heard a lot about your work, Mr. Trent," Jessica said politely as she took a seat beside him. Howard smiled, his eyes glinting with a mixture of charm and self-assurance. "The pleasure is mine, Ms. Fletcher. Your books have been a huge influence on my writing. I'd like to think I've learned a thing or two from your methods." Jessica nodded, offering a modest smile. "It's always rewarding to know that one's work has had an impact." Howard leaned in slightly, his voice lowering, as if to impart a secret. Well, I must admit, I've been working on something quite special for this event. It's a new manuscript, unpublished, that I'm hoping to share with the right audience soon. It's a mystery, a bit of a departure from my usual historical dramas. Jessica raised an eyebrow. A mystery, you say? Howard chuckled, his fingers tapping the glass of wine in his hand. Yes, something that combines the thrill of the unknown with the intricacies of the human psyche. I'm sure it'll resonate with fans of your work. Jessica's interest was piqued, and she felt a sudden sense of caution. Authors were often protective of their unpublished work, especially those with as much fame as Howard. She wondered what made him decide to share it with her, a stranger among his peers. But before she could probe further, Eleanor returned to the conversation, her smile still present, though her gaze seemed to linger on Howard for just a moment longer than necessary. Miss Fletcher, I'm so glad you're getting to know Howard. He's one of our brightest stars, Eleanor said. Perhaps you'd like to join us for a more private reading of his latest manuscript later tonight. I think you'll find it quite intriguing. Jessica was about to respond when the sound of laughter interrupted them. A woman approached, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. She was tall, with striking features, and a confident air that seemed to command attention. This was Veronica Quinn, a local author who had once been a close friend of Howard's. Veronica had made a name for herself with her romantic novels, though her recent works hadn't garnered the same praise. Howard, always the charmer, Veronica said, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she joined the group. Her eyes flicked briefly to Jessica before she focused on Howard. I see you're already working your magic on the guest of honor. I hope you don't mind, Ms. Fletcher. Howard's always been one to charm his way into people's good graces. Jessica smiled politely, sensing the tension in the air. There was something about the way Veronica spoke that suggested a deeper history between the two, one that was far from friendly. Howard's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. Veronica, you know I'm just being polite. Polite? Veronica scoffed. You mean manipulative, as usual? Jessica could feel the undercurrent of animosity between them, and for a moment she wondered if the evening was about to take a more dramatic turn. But before she could intervene, Eleanor was already guiding everyone toward the next room, where the evening's formal activities would begin. As they moved, Jessica glanced at the manuscript that Howard had left on the table. It was wrapped in a simple leather cover, but there was something about it that caught her attention. The way the edges of the paper seemed slightly worn, as if it had been handled by many hands. Jessica was about to leave it behind, but something urged her to pick it up. She could feel the weight of the story within its pages, a story that seemed to carry more than just ink on paper. There was an unsettling sense that the contents of this manuscript held the key to something much darker than anyone in the room realized. Eleanor smiled as she handed Jessica the manuscript. Take it, Ms. Fletcher. I think you'll find it quite compelling. Jessica hesitated for only a moment before accepting the gift. She had no idea then that this simple gesture would lead her down a path she would never forget, one filled with betrayal, secrets, and a murder that no one saw coming. Chapter 2. The Deadly Clue. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Lancaster Literary Society, casting long shadows across the grand hallway. Jessica had spent a restless night, tossing and turning as her thoughts replayed the events of the evening before. Howard's manuscript, now sitting on the bedside table, had been the subject of her sleepless musings. There was something unsettling about the way the pages had felt in her hands, something almost too familiar. She had barely skimmed through it, but the few lines she had read echoed in her mind, especially one particular section that seemed to mirror the strange, unsolved murder that had occurred in the town only a few months ago, The local police had never been able to crack the case. A young woman named Lydia Martin had been found dead in the woods just outside Lancaster, her body displaying signs of foul play. The townspeople had whispered rumours. Some said it was a lover's quarrel gone wrong, others suspected a robbery, and a few even hinted at a more sinister conspiracy. But no one had any definitive answers. The case had gone cold, and the town had returned to its quiet routine. Until now. Now, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that Howard's story had somehow connected to Lydia's death. By mid-morning, the event schedule called for a private reading of Howard's new manuscript. Eleanor had been insistent that Jessica attend, and though Jessica had planned to review the manuscript in more depth that morning, she decided to put her suspicions aside, at least for a little while. After all, she was here to offer insights into writing, not to unravel a murder mystery. But something told her that these two worlds, literature and crime, were about to collide in ways she hadn't imagined. The private reading took place in a cozy sitting room with only a handful of attendees. Howard sat at the front, his usual charisma on full display, as he began to read aloud from the manuscript. His voice was smooth and deliberate, and the words seemed to flow effortlessly. Jessica tried to focus on the story, but as Howard read, her mind kept drifting back to the peculiar line she had glimpsed earlier. It was a passage about a woman's mysterious death, and the way it was described mirrored Lydia Martin's untimely end. As Howard continued, Jessica's unease grew. She had not imagined the connection, but it was undeniable now. The murder in the manuscript was not just similar, it was disturbingly close to the real event. The story described a young woman, a local resident, found dead in a secluded area with the same signs of a struggle and the same chillingly vague details. The only difference was the name in the manuscript, Lily Albright. Jessica couldn't help but think it was too coincidental. Was Howard trying to use the tragedy for literary inspiration, or was there something more sinister at play? Jessica's gaze shifted to the faces around the room. Everyone seemed enraptured by Howard's reading, nodding along in approval. But there was one person who didn't seem to share the same enthusiasm: Veronica Quinn. She was sitting near the back, her arms crossed tightly, her face expressionless. She had attended the reading reluctantly, it seemed, and as the passage about the murder in the woods continued, Jessica saw Veronica's lips tighten. Was it guilt? Or was she just as disturbed by the uncanny resemblance to the real murder as Jessica was? Howard finished reading the section, and a small round of applause broke out. He looked pleased with himself, clearly expecting more praise, but Jessica's mind was elsewhere. She waited until the others began chatting amongst themselves before she excused herself, moving towards Howard. He was already standing, smiling and accepting compliments, but Jessica's approach stopped him in his tracks. "Mr. Trent," she said, her tone measured but direct. "That was quite a captivating reading, but I must admit I couldn't help but notice the striking resemblance between your story and the recent murder in town, Lydia Martin. The details about Lily Albright's death, they're almost identical." Howard's smile faltered for a moment, and Jessica caught a glimpse of something. Was it fear? Guilt? But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He cleared his throat, straightening his jacket. "Miss Fletcher," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge. "I assure you, I had no intention of copying a real crime. I've written this story entirely from my imagination. Any similarities are purely coincidental. I'm sure you understand that fiction often mirrors reality, though, don't you?" Jessica nodded, but her instincts told her otherwise. She could see the faintest twitch of his eye, the stiffening of his posture. It was as though he was bracing himself for something, or someone. "I understand," Jessica replied carefully, her voice calm. "But the details are just too close to be a coincidence. Have you been following the case? Or perhaps, do you know more than you're letting on?" Howard laughed, but it was too forced to be genuine. "I'm not sure what you mean, Ms. Fletcher. I live in this town, so of course I've heard the rumors." "But that's all they are, rumors." Jessica could see he was growing uncomfortable under her scrutiny, but before she could press further, Eleanor stepped in, as if sensing the rising tension. "Ms. Fletcher, if I may," Eleanor interjected, her tone bright and professional. "Howard's manuscript is purely fiction. I'm sure there's no need to dwell on such dark matters. We're here to celebrate his work." Jessica offered Eleanor a tight smile, but remained unconvinced. Eleanor's eagerness to smooth over the situation struck Jessica as somewhat odd. It was as if she were covering for Howard, making excuses before anyone could dig too deeply into the subject. But Jessica knew better than to push too hard in front of an audience. "I agree," Jessica said, glancing at the others who had gathered around. "For now I'll let it go, but Howard, I do think it's worth revisiting that manuscript, if only to ensure your portrayal of events stays as fictional as you intend it to be." Howard nodded, but the tension between them lingered in the air. Jessica turned away, her thoughts still churning. As she moved toward the exit, she caught Veronica's eye. Veronica didn't smile, but her expression softened as their gazes met. Without a word, Veronica stood up and walked out the door, her steps deliberate. Jessica knew she couldn't ignore the mounting sense of unease. Howard Trent's story was no mere coincidence, and someone in that room, if not Howard, knew more than they were letting on. The clues were starting to form, but Jessica knew the truth wasn't going to come easily. As Jessica stood on the balcony overlooking the sprawling grounds of the estate, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her gut. The manuscript, the similarities to the real murder, the secretive glances exchanged between Howard and Veronica, everything pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Someone in this room had a hand in Lydia Martin's death, and Jessica Fletcher was going to find out who. Chapter 3. The investigation begins. The early morning fog had settled thick over Lancaster, casting a quiet hush over the town as Jessica made her way to the local police station. It had been a restless night, her mind still spinning with the implications of Howard Trent's manuscript and the eerie similarities to Lydia Martin's death. The more she thought about it, the more she was convinced that something was wrong, and it was no coincidence that Howard's writing had mirrored the real-life crime so closely. There was too much at stake here, too much secrecy, and Jessica knew that if she was going to get to the bottom of it, she would need to dig deeper. As she walked into the station, the familiar scent of coffee and paperwork greeted her. The place was small and modest, but it served its purpose. She was greeted by Sergeant Mark Simmons, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face that had seen too many cases. He was in his late 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor that Jessica had always respected. "Miss Fletcher," he said, offering a firm handshake. "I take it you hear about the murder. Lydia Martin, right?" "Yes, that's correct," Jessica replied, her voice steady. "I've been looking into the case, and I have a few questions. It seems there might be some connections between the murder and a recent manuscript I've been given by Howard Trent." Simmons raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "You're saying Trent's manuscript has something to do with Lydia Martin's death?" "I can't say for certain yet," Jessica responded, her eyes narrowing as she continued. "But the details in the manuscript are disturbingly close to what we know about Lydia's death. The location, the manner of death, even the way the victim is described, it's all too similar to be a coincidence." Simmons folded his arms across his chest, leaning against the desk, I don't know, Howard Trent's a successful author. He writes thrillers, for crying out loud. What's to say he didn't just pull inspiration from the local news? Writers do it all the time. Jessica nodded, but didn't let the dismissal deter her. I understand. But after spending some time with him last night, I'm not so sure that's the case. There's something about his reaction when I mentioned the similarities that felt off. It's like he knows more than he's letting on. Simmons sighed, his expression softening. I hear you, Miss Fletcher, and I'm willing to consider anything, but you've got to understand we don't have much to go on with Lydia's murder. It was a brutal crime, sure, but the investigation hasn't turned up any solid leads. We're still working on a few potential theories, but it's mostly a dead end at this point. I understand, Jessica said, her voice steady. But I'm convinced that this manuscript holds the key to something. Maybe it'll lead us to something we missed before. Simmons rubbed his chin thoughtfully. All right, I'll bite. What do you want to do next? I'd like to speak with some of the people who were closest to Lydia, Jessica replied. Her friends, family, anyone who might know something that could help. Simmons hesitated before nodding. I can set up some interviews, but I don't want you getting in the way of our investigation. Just be careful, okay? I will, Jessica assured him, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. I'm just here to help. Later that afternoon, Jessica found herself sitting in the modest living room of Lydia Martin's parents, Robert and Margaret Martin. They were an older couple, both in their early 60s, and their faces were marked with the grief that had consumed them since their daughter's death. Robert sat by the window, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, while Margaret wrung a handkerchief between her fingers, occasionally dabbing at her eyes. Jessica had expected the interview to be emotional, and she wasn't disappointed. The Martins spoke fondly of Lydia, recounting her bright personality and her love for the town. But as the conversation continued, Jessica's mind began to wander. There was a certain heaviness in the air, a feeling that something wasn't being said. The Martins were clearly devastated by their daughter's death, but there was also something guarded about them. Miss Fletcher, Margaret began softly, her voice trembling. Do you think someone did this to our daughter on purpose? Was it some sort of random attack? Jessica paused for a moment, her eyes locking with Margaret's. It's hard to say for certain, Mrs. Martin, but based on what I've learned so far, it doesn't seem like a random crime. It appears to have been deliberate. Robert shook his head, his face hardening. It wasn't random, I know it wasn't. Someone did this to her, someone who knew her, but we don't know who. We don't have any enemies. Lydia was a good girl, always helping others. She didn't deserve this. Jessica's mind whirled as she listened to Robert's words. It was clear that the Martins believed their daughter's death was personal, but they had no idea who could be behind it. It was frustrating, but not unexpected. Was there anyone in particular who Lydia had been in conflict with recently? Jessica asked, her voice soft but probing. Robert glanced at his wife before answering. There were a few people, I suppose. But Lydia was always so forgiving, always trying to make amends. If she had a falling out with anyone, she'd make sure to fix it. She was the peacemaker in this family. Margaret added, she did mention a few months ago that she had been getting strange messages. She didn't go into detail, but it seemed like someone had been harassing her. We tried to get her to tell us more, but she wouldn't. She said it was nothing. Jessica's eyes narrowed. This was new information, something that hadn't been mentioned in the police reports. Did she ever say who was sending the messages? No, Robert replied, his voice growing tense. She didn't. But I wish she had. Maybe we could have stopped it. Jessica's instincts told her that this might be a crucial lead. It wasn't much, but it was something to go on. I'm going to look into this further. If you can think of anything else, no matter how small, please let me know. Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with sadness. We just want to know who did this to our daughter. Jessica rose from her seat, her mind already racing with possibilities. As she left the Martins' home, her thoughts drifted back to the manuscript and to the unsettling feeling she had about Howard Trent. There was something lurking beneath the surface, something that wasn't being said, and Jessica knew that she was getting closer to the truth. The more she learned, the more she realized that Lydia's death wasn't just a random crime. It was the culmination of a series of events that had been set in motion long before that fateful night in the woods. And somehow, Howard Trent's manuscript, with its twisted portrayal of murder, was linked to it all. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but Jessica knew that the real challenge was still ahead, uncovering the dark secrets that everyone seemed desperate to keep hidden. Chapter 4. The Secret Past. Jessica Fletcher was no stranger to secrets. In her years of solving mysteries, she had discovered that beneath every smooth exterior there was often a hidden story, something untold, something buried. As she walked through the quiet streets of Lancaster that afternoon, the weight of the clues she had uncovered thus far pressed heavily on her. Howard Trent's manuscript was still gnawing at her, and the disturbing similarities to Lydia Martin's murder were growing harder to ignore. But there was something more, something beneath the surface of this town that Jessica needed to understand. Her first stop was the local historical society. Lancaster, though small, had a rich history that stretched back for centuries. As she entered the society's office, she was greeted by a young woman behind the desk who introduced herself as Clara. Clara was eager to help, and Jessica wasted no time. "I'm looking for any information on Howard Trent," Jessica said, her tone polite but purposeful. "Specifically his past. Anything that could help shed light on his history here in Lancaster." Clara's eyebrows knitted together and she hesitated for a moment. "Howard Trent, you're not the first person to ask about him recently. I don't know if I can help much, but I'll check the archives." Clara led Jessica to the back of the room, where rows of dusty boxes filled with town records lined the shelves. She pulled out a file that looked well worn, its edges frayed with age. As Clara opened it, she glanced up at Jessica. "Howard Trent didn't grow up here. He moved to Lancaster about 15 years ago. He was always a bit of a mystery, to be honest." Jessica nodded. "What do you mean?" "Well, he was married before," Clara said, her voice lowering as she leafed through the papers. "To a woman named Lillian. She disappeared about 10 years ago, just after they moved here. The police never found her, but there were rumors, whispers that Howard had something to do with it." Jessica felt a jolt of recognition. Lillian. The name was familiar, and it had surfaced once before, during her brief conversation with Howard the night before. But he had been evasive when she asked about his first wife. Now, Clara's words brought a new layer of suspicion to the surface. "Disappeared? What happened to her?" Jessica asked, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. Clara looked at her, clearly conflicted. "It was a strange case. Lillian was last seen at a party, and after that, no one heard from her again. Howard seemed distraught at first, but then, well, after a while he stopped talking about her altogether. No one in town seemed to know much, and the police could never find any solid evidence. They declared it a missing persons case, but no one really believed it was just an accident." Jessica absorbed the information, her mind racing. Lillian's disappearance had been hushed up for years, but now it seemed to be more than just a tragic mystery. Jessica had seen this kind of pattern before, where a missing persons case wasn't what it seemed on the surface. And now, with Lydia Martin's murder echoing a plot from Howard's manuscript, Jessica was beginning to wonder if there was a darker connection between Howard's past and the recent events in town. "Do you have any more details on Lillian? A photograph, perhaps?" Jessica asked, her eyes scanning the records Clara had pulled out. Clara nodded and walked over to a nearby filing cabinet, rummaging through it for a moment before pulling out a faded photograph. She handed it to Jessica. The woman in the photo was young, with bright eyes and a warm smile. She looked like she belonged in another time, another place. But there was something haunting about her expression, as though the photo had been taken on the cusp of something dark. Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that this woman's disappearance had somehow set off a chain of events leading to Lydia Martin's murder. "Thank you, Clara," Jessica said, her voice soft with gratitude. "This helps more than you know." As Jessica left the Historical Society, her thoughts swirled. She had known Howard Trent for less than 24 hours, but already she was beginning to see a pattern in his life, one marked by loss, secrets, and now a murder that seemed to follow in the footsteps of his past. That evening, Jessica found herself at the local cafe, where she had arranged to meet Veronica Quinn. Veronica had been distant ever since their brief interaction the previous evening, but Jessica knew that her insight might provide crucial pieces to the puzzle. As Veronica walked in, she gave Jessica a wary look before taking a seat. "I didn't think I'd see you again so soon, Ms. Fletcher," Veronica said, her voice laced with a mix of curiosity and guardedness. "I thought I made it clear I'm not interested in talking about Howard." "I understand," Jessica replied gently. "But I think we both know there's more to this story than just Howard's manuscript. I'd like to hear your side, Veronica. If you know anything about his past, about Lillian, it could help me understand what's really going on." Veronica's face hardened, and she sat back in her chair, crossing her arms defensively. "What do you want from me? You think I have some kind of information about Howard's first wife?" "I think you know more than you're letting on," Jessica said quietly, meeting Veronica's eyes. "You and Howard were close once. I can't help but wonder if there's a connection between Lillian's disappearance and the murder of Lydia Martin. A connection that might involve Howard more than he's willing to admit." Veronica sighed heavily, rubbing her forehead as though battling an inner conflict. "You don't know what you're asking, Ms. Fletcher. Howard and we had our problems. We were close once, but that was a long time ago. As for Lillian, I don't know what happened to her. I never did. But I know one thing for sure. Howard changed after she disappeared. He wasn't the same man." "Changed how?" Jessica pressed, leaning forward slightly, her voice soft. "He became colder," Veronica said, her voice almost a whisper. "Distant. And that's when he started writing. I think it was his way of dealing with everything, his guilt, his grief, whatever it was he was hiding. But the man I knew, he wasn't capable of what you think he is. He's not a killer, Miss Fletcher, not in the way you're thinking." Jessica watched Veronica carefully, weighing her words. Veronica's testimony wasn't definitive, but it was another piece of the puzzle. She wasn't sure whether to trust Howard, but Jessica's instincts told her there was more to his story than he was letting on. Before they could continue the conversation, Jessica's phone buzzed, breaking the moment. It was Sergeant Simmons. "I've got something for you, Miss Fletcher," he said when she answered. "I dug into Lillian's case a bit more. Turns out there was a witness who saw something the night she disappeared. They didn't come forward at the time, but they're willing to talk now." Jessica's heart raced as she excused herself from the table. Veronica's expression followed her as she left, but Jessica had no time to dwell on it. The truth was beginning to take shape, but it was still shrouded in layers of secrets. She knew she was getting closer, but she also knew that uncovering the past might be the key to solving the murder that had rocked Lancaster. Chapter 5. The Poisoned Pen. Jessica Fletcher stood at the edge of the wooded area just outside Lancaster, her eyes scanning the tranquil surroundings. The faint rustle of leaves in the breeze seemed to mock her as she stood still, contemplating the chilling details that had begun to tie Howard Trent's manuscript to the recent murder of Lydia Martin. The connections were becoming undeniable, and each piece of the puzzle only led to more questions. After meeting with Veronica Quinn, Jessica had gone straight to the Lancaster Police Department. Sergeant Simmons had made it clear that they were still working on leads, but he was open to any help she could offer. That afternoon, he'd informed her about a new development in the Lydia Martin case, a witness who had seen something the night of the murder. A man named Frank Roberts, a local truck driver who often passed through the area, had claimed to see a figure near the woods where Lydia's body had been found. The figure was described as being tall, wearing a dark coat, but the identity had remained unclear. What caught Jessica's attention was the timing. The sighting had occurred shortly after Lydia had been reported missing, at a time when the town's attention had been focused on other matters. Now, standing in the very woods where Lydia had met her end, Jessica's thoughts kept returning to the unsettling feeling that Howard's manuscript had triggered. The victim in his story, Lily Albright, had been murdered in a similar manner to Lydia. Both women had been found in secluded areas, their deaths marked by violence that seemed calculated and deliberate. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Sergeant Simmons again. "It's Fletcher. I've got something new. We've traced the poison used in Lydia's murder. It's a rare compound, used only in certain circles. I've already checked with the local suppliers and we've got a lead. I think you should take a look at this," Simmons said. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. She quickly thanked Simmons and made her way to the station. When Jessica arrived at the station, Simmons was waiting for her in the small office that had become the hub of their investigation. He handed her a folder containing a printout of the information he had uncovered. The poison used was a rare alkaloid, not something you find in every garden or pharmacy. It's used by people who know what they're doing. Only a few labs in the area handle it, but there's one supplier, an old apothecary shop in the city. They've been under surveillance for other reasons, but their records show a purchase last month. The buyer? Howard Trent? Jessica's breath caught in her throat. Howard Trent? Simmons nodded. "I'm afraid so. He bought enough to make a lethal dose, and the records show he picked it up personally. But here's the thing, the purchase was made the day after Lydia was reported missing." Jessica stared at the paper in disbelief. Howard had been involved with the murder, not just indirectly through his manuscript, but through his own actions. The pieces were falling into place in a way that made Jessica's stomach turn. Howard's manuscript had described a woman's death at the hands of someone who knew her intimately. And now it seemed that Howard's purchase of a rare poison might be the key to solving the case. "I need to speak with him," Jessica said, her voice steady despite the swirling emotions. "Now." Simmons hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "I'll arrange it, but you'll need to be careful. We don't have all the evidence yet, and Howard's not going to confess easily." The next morning, Jessica arrived at Howard Trent's home. It was an imposing structure perched on a hill overlooking the town. The stone exterior was well maintained, but the place seemed cold, an appropriate reflection of the man who lived there. She rang the doorbell and Howard himself answered, his usual charm absent from his features. His face was tight, his jaw clenched, as if he knew this conversation was not going to be pleasant. "Ms. Fletcher?" he said, his voice lacking its usual warmth. "What brings you to my doorstep?" "I need to talk to you, Howard," Jessica said, her tone firm but not confrontational. "It's about the murder of Lydia Martin." At the mention of Lydia's name, Howard's expression flickered. There was something almost imperceptible about his reaction, but Jessica didn't miss it. She stepped past him into the foyer, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The house was full of books, as expected, but there was a sterile quality to the space. No personal photos, no sign of a life outside of writing. It was as if Howard had carefully curated the appearance of his home to reflect his professional persona, an image that now seemed to crumble under the weight of his past actions. "Lydia Martin," Howard repeated, his voice slightly strained. "I don't see how that's any of your concern." "It is my concern," Jessica replied. "You've been connected to her death in more ways than one. You purchased the poison that killed her, and I have to ask, why?" Howard's face turned pale, his hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, Jessica thought he might deny everything, but instead he sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging with the weight of whatever he was about to reveal. "I didn't want this," he muttered, almost to himself. "I never wanted it to happen this way, but it was the only way." Jessica took a step closer. "What do you mean, Howard?" He glanced at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and something darker, guilt perhaps. "Lydia had something on me. Something from my past. She threatened to expose it, to ruin everything I had built. She was relentless. I couldn't let her do that. I thought if I scared her enough, if I made her understand that I was in control, she would back off. But I made a mistake. I underestimated her. She wasn't afraid of me." Howard paused, and Jessica could see the fight inside him, whether it was a fight to maintain control over his emotions or a deeper internal struggle, she wasn't sure. "I didn't mean for it to go this far, but when I saw her with that man in the woods, I knew she was planning to ruin me, so I did what I thought I had to do." Jessica's mind raced. The man in the woods Howard had mentioned must have been a reference to someone Lydia had been involved with, someone she trusted. Could it have been Frank Roberts, the truck driver, who had seen a figure near the woods? Or was it someone closer to Howard? "And the manuscript, Howard?" Jessica asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Was that also a way to deflect from your past?" Howard flinched, his face twitching with the realization that his darkest secrets were now being exposed. "The manuscript, I wrote it as a way to cope. I thought if I created a story where I was the hero, where I controlled the narrative, maybe I could redeem myself, but it's all just fiction, Miss Fletcher. You've got it wrong. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." "But someone did," Jessica countered. "Lydia Martin is dead, and you're involved in her death more than you're willing to admit." The silence that followed was thick, charged with the weight of truth that had come crashing down on Howard. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and it was clear that the confession Jessica had been waiting for was right on the cusp. Jessica's heart pounded. She had the pieces, but Howard's confession wasn't complete. There was more to the story, and it was up to Jessica to piece it together before another life was lost. Chapter 6. The Unlikely Suspect. The days following her conversation with Howard Trent had been a whirlwind of conflicting emotions for Jessica Fletcher. Howard's confession had been unsettling, to say the least. The admission that he had been involved in Lydia Martin's death, however reluctantly, was a blow to the image she had built of the once successful author. But as she reflected on their conversation, the pieces didn't quite. Howard had confessed to being involved, but something in his words didn't sit right. His guilt felt too manufactured, too convenient. It was almost as if he was trying to absolve himself by offering up a half-truth. The more Jessica thought about it, the more certain she became. Howard Trent was not the whole story. He was a part of it, sure, but the deeper she dug, the more it became clear that there were others in Lancaster who had something to hide. She had decided to turn her attention to Eleanor Greenfield, the event organizer who had initially introduced Jessica to Howard. Something about Eleanor had struck Jessica as odd from the start. Her eagerness to protect Howard, her swift attempts to deflect attention from his past, and the way she had practically shoved Jessica into the reading of Howard's manuscript the night before the murder. Eleanor had always been the perfect hostess, the charming and composed figure who seemed to have everything under control. But Jessica knew better than to trust appearances. Beneath that polished surface, there had to be something more, something that had prompted Eleanor to act the way she had. The next morning, Jessica drove to the Greenfield estate. Eleanor's home was as grand as one would expect from a woman in her position, an old Victorian mansion nestled on the outskirts of town, surrounded by sprawling gardens that looked as though they had been carefully manicured for decades. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as Jessica approached the front door. She rang the bell, and within moments Eleanor answered, her expression as warm and welcoming as ever. "Miss Fletcher, it's so good to see you again," Eleanor said with a forced smile, stepping aside to let Jessica enter. "I was wondering when you'd stop by. Please, come in. I'm sure you have a lot of questions." Jessica took a seat in the living room, noting the immaculate furnishings and the absence of personal touches that would normally define a home. There were no family photos, no mementos from travels or memories. It felt more like a display home than a residence, and that in itself made Jessica uneasy. "I've been doing some thinking, Eleanor," Jessica began, her tone measured, "about the events that transpired at the Literary Society and the connection between Howard Trent and Lydia Martin's murder." Eleanor's face tightened imperceptibly, but she kept her composure. "I know where this is going, Ms. Fletcher, and I assure you I had nothing to do with Lydia's death. You can't possibly think that I'm not accusing you, Eleanor," Jessica interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "But I do think there's more to this story than you're letting on. Your behavior, your protectiveness of Howard, it all seems a little too rehearsed." Eleanor's smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered. "I understand your concern. Howard is complicated, but I've known him for years. He's been a close friend, and when you're as close to someone as I am to him, you defend them, you try to help." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "You've known Howard for years, you say? How long exactly?" Eleanor hesitated before answering. "A long time. Since before his first book was published, actually. We worked together in the early days when Howard was just starting out. I helped him build his career, introduced him to the right people, made sure his work was seen by the right publishers. You could say I'm responsible for his success." Jessica leaned forward slightly, her mind processing the new information. "And what about his first wife, Lillian? What can you tell me about her?" The mention of Lillian's name caused Eleanor's face to pale. For the first time during their conversation, Jessica saw a crack in Eleanor's calm demeanor. Lillian was a difficult woman. She had her own issues, her own ambitions, but Howard loved her in his way. "But she disappeared," Jessica pressed. "And Howard seemed to move on rather quickly. You're telling me that was just coincidence?" Eleanor shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting to the window as if looking for a way to escape. "I don't know what happened to Lillian. I'm not sure anyone does. But Howard was devastated when she left. I just think he didn't handle it well. He threw himself into his work." Jessica had been expecting a defensive answer, but Eleanor's response only raised more questions. The subtle unease in her voice, the way she avoided eye contact when discussing Lillian, it all pointed to something more. Jessica didn't believe for a second that Eleanor was being entirely truthful. "I think you're hiding something, Eleanor," Jessica said, her voice low and calm. "I think you know more about Lillian's disappearance than you're letting on. And I think that might be the key to understanding what happened to Lydia Martin." Eleanor's eyes flashed with something. Fear, maybe, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. She stood abruptly, her movements stiff. "I don't know what you're talking about, Miss Fletcher. I've told you everything I know. I had nothing to do with Lydia's death, and I certainly had no hand in Lillian's disappearance." Jessica stood as well, sensing that the conversation was reaching its tipping point. "Maybe, but I have a feeling you're not telling me the whole truth. And if you're hiding something, Eleanor, it's not just about Howard's past, it's about your own." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment Jessica thought she might crack under the pressure. But then Eleanor's gaze hardened, and she took a step back, her posture straightening. "Miss Fletcher, I'm done discussing this," Eleanor said coldly. "If you want to continue your investigation, you're welcome to, but I suggest you stay out of my personal affairs." With that, she turned on her heel and left the room, leaving Jessica standing in the middle of the polished, sterile living room. Jessica felt a knot tighten in her chest. Eleanor Greenfield was hiding something significant. As she walked out of the house, Jessica's mind raced. She was no closer to understanding the full extent of Eleanor's involvement in the case, but one thing was certain. There was more to Eleanor's past with Howard than either of them were willing to admit. And Jessica was going to get to the bottom of it, no matter how deep she had to dig. Chapter 7. The Final Clue. The following morning, Jessica Fletcher found herself walking through the quiet streets of Lancaster with a sense of purpose. The events of the past few days, Howard's unsettling confession, Eleanor's evasive behavior, and the buried secrets of the town had all led to one inescapable conclusion. She had been playing a dangerous game, piecing together the fractured narratives of the people she had met along the way, but there was still something missing, something crucial that would bring the whole story into focus. Her meeting with Eleanor the day before had only deepened the mystery. Eleanor's attempts to deflect Jessica's questions, her clear discomfort when the topic of Lillian came up, there was too much left unsaid. The more Jessica thought about it, the more she became convinced that Eleanor was hiding a key piece of the puzzle. But there was something else, the idea that Howard Trent was just a small part of a much larger story, and it was time to finish it. Jessica's first stop that morning was the local police station. Sergeant Simmons had called her early to say that he had uncovered something new, something she needed to see. As she entered the station, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. The air was heavy, and the usual buzz of activity seemed quieter than usual. Simmons was waiting for her in the back office, his face grim. "Ms. Fletcher, thanks for coming by so quickly," he said, motioning for her to sit down. "We've made a breakthrough. It's about Lydia Martin's murder." Jessica sat down, her heart racing. "What did you find, Sergeant?" Simmons opened a folder and laid several documents in front of her. "It's not much, but it's enough to make us take another look at things. We've located the person who was with Lydia the night she disappeared. It turns out Lydia was meeting with someone the night she died. And that person, well, it's someone we've already interviewed but didn't think much of." Jessica's mind clicked into gear. "Who is it?" Simmons hesitated before answering. "Frank Roberts, the truck driver." Jessica's brow furrowed. The same Frank Roberts who claimed to have seen someone in the woods that night. The very same, Simmons replied. But here's the twist. We've reviewed his phone records. He was in contact with Lydia just hours before she went missing. It wasn't just a random sighting of someone in the woods. He knew she was going to be there. Jessica leaned forward, piecing together the new information. That changes everything. Frank Roberts was involved with Lydia, but he wasn't the killer. Simmons nodded. Exactly. But the key piece here is that we've learned something about Frank that complicates matters. He and Eleanor Greenfield were in contact around the time of Lydia's death, and not just in passing. They exchanged several calls in the days leading up to it. Jessica's mind raced. Eleanor and Frank? This new detail added an unexpected layer to the investigation. So Eleanor's involved with Frank? Simmons paused before speaking. We're not sure yet, but it's looking that way. What's interesting is that Frank had a motive. He had been in debt, and Lydia had been helping him financially, probably as a result of their relationship. Eleanor, on the other hand, had a financial interest in both of them. And the more we dig into the connections, the more it looks like Eleanor was the one pulling the strings. Jessica's thoughts spun. Eleanor had a reason to want Lydia out of the picture. She wasn't just protecting Howard Trent. She was trying to protect herself. But how does Howard fit into all of this? Simmons shook his head. That's what we're still working on. But this new information leads us to believe that Eleanor might have been trying to eliminate any threat to her position, both personally and financially. She saw Lydia as a rival, someone who could ruin her carefully constructed life. Jessica stood up, her resolve firming. We need to confront her, Sergeant. Eleanor knows more than she's letting on. She's been playing both sides, Howard's, Frank's, and her own. And it's time she faced the truth. The confrontation with Eleanor came sooner than Jessica had expected. It was late afternoon when she made her way to Eleanor's mansion. The house was quiet again, a faint chill hanging in the air as Jessica rang the doorbell. This time, there was no welcoming smile. Eleanor answered the door with a sharp, almost defensive expression. "Miss Fletcher," she said coolly, "what do you want now?" Jessica didn't hesitate. "I know everything, Eleanor. The phone records, the financial ties, your involvement with Frank Roberts and Lydia Martin's murder. It's all too much to ignore." Eleanor's face went pale, her features hardening as the realization settled in. She glanced over her shoulder as though considering whether to shut the door or let Jessica inside. Finally, she stepped back, motioning for Jessica to enter. "You don't understand, Miss Fletcher," Eleanor said as Jessica entered the house. "This isn't what you think. I didn't want any of this. I only wanted to protect my life, my career, my reputation." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "You've been manipulating everyone? Howard, Frank, Lydia. You thought you could control everything, but now you've lost control. Lydia wasn't just a threat to Howard. She was a threat to you, too. She had what you didn't want anyone to know." Eleanor took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she fidgeted with the hem of her blouse. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. "I was just trying to protect myself. Frank was in trouble and he needed help. But Lydia wasn't going to let up. She kept threatening to expose everything, and I just couldn't let her do that. I didn't want to lose everything I had." Jessica's mind worked furiously. Eleanor had been living a double life, and in her desperation, she had gone to extreme lengths to cover up her secrets. She had used Howard to keep her story straight, used Frank to eliminate a financial threat, and when Lydia became a liability, Eleanor had done whatever she thought necessary to protect herself. "What did you do, Eleanor?" Jessica asked quietly. "Tell me what really happened that night." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears and she looked away. "I didn't kill Lydia. But I did everything I could to make sure she wouldn't talk. Frank was supposed to scare her, but I didn't realize how far he would go. When he told me she was dead, I didn't know what to do. And Howard didn't even know about Frank or the poison. I kept him out of it. But I knew that if Lydia's death came back to haunt me, it would ruin everything. I had to protect myself, even if it meant losing my integrity. Jessica nodded slowly, understanding the weight of Eleanor's confession. Eleanor had been desperate to maintain control over her life, her secrets, and in the process, she had become a player in a much larger scheme, a scheme that led to murder. "You will face the consequences for your actions, Eleanor," Jessica said, her voice calm but resolute. "But you're not the only one to blame. Howard and Frank too, they all played a part in this. But you, Eleanor, you pulled the strings." As Jessica turned to leave, she knew that the case wasn't over yet. There were still many pieces to the puzzle, but the truth was now within reach. Eleanor's confession had uncovered the final clue, and it was clear that the secrets of Lancaster were much darker than anyone had imagined. Chapter 8. The Truth Uncovered. Jessica Fletcher stood at the edge of the quiet, foggy town of Lancaster, her mind still working through the pieces of the puzzle that had brought her here. It had been a long and winding road, from the chilling manuscript of Howard Trent to Eleanor Greenfield's manipulations to the cryptic messages of Lydia Martin's final days. But now, at long last, the truth was coming into focus. The twisted web of secrets, lies, and betrayals was unraveling, one thread at a time. The pieces were all there, but the question remained, would the people who needed to face the consequences ever truly understand the damage they had caused? Jessica glanced over at the Lancaster police station, where Sergeant Simmons had promised to have a meeting to finalize the case. But before heading in, Jessica allowed herself a moment of reflection. Everything about this case, from the way it started with a seemingly innocent manuscript to the tangled relationships and hidden motives of those involved, had reminded her of the darker side of human nature. The need for power, control, and revenge could make people do unimaginable things. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what would be the final confrontation, and walked toward the station. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, but there was a sense of closure in the air as well. The police had finally gathered enough evidence to charge Eleanor Greenfield with accessory to murder. Frank Roberts, the truck driver who had been involved in Lydia's death, had been arrested for his role in the murder. As for Howard Trent, Jessica wasn't sure where his story would end. While he had been deeply involved in the cover-up, the law could not yet prove that he had been directly responsible for Lydia's death, but the authorities were working to charge him with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Jessica had a sinking feeling that Howard too was hiding something, but today was not about him. Today was about Lydia Martin and her tragic death. Sergeant Simmons was waiting for her in his office, his face grim but resolute. "Miss Fletcher," he said, gesturing for her to sit down. "I think we've got it all. It's been a complicated case, but I think we're finally closing in on the truth." Jessica took her seat across from him, her eyes steady. "I'm listening." "We've secured Eleanor's confession," Simmons said, sliding a file toward her. "She's admitted to having a hand in orchestrating Lydia's death, though she's still claiming she didn't kill her. But her role in manipulating Frank Roberts and keeping Howard Trent in the dark is undeniable. She was using her influence over both men to protect her own reputation and career. She knew that if Lydia continued to get in the way, she'd be exposed, so she removed the threat. Jessica nodded, her thoughts lingering on Eleanor's confession. It's clear she was more than just a bystander. She was the mastermind, pulling the strings behind the scenes. She played both sides, using Howard and Frank to do her bidding, all while making sure her own hands stayed clean. Simmons looked up from the file, his eyes heavy with understanding. Exactly. Eleanor had a lot to lose. She had invested too much in Howard's career, and when Lydia threatened to expose their financial ties and her influence, she couldn't afford to let her live. She thought she could control the situation with Frank's help, but Frank took things too far. And when he killed Lydia, Eleanor was left to clean up the mess. Jessica sighed deeply. It's always the people closest to you, isn't it? Howard's career, Frank's debts, they all became tangled in Eleanor's desire to maintain control. And in the end, it cost Lydia her life. Simmons nodded solemnly. But there's one more thing, Jessica. Frank Roberts' involvement wasn't just about Lydia's finances. There's evidence that he and Eleanor had an affair. She used him, emotionally and financially, to further her own agenda. He was another piece of her puzzle, and when he became expendable, she let him take the fall for Lydia's death. Jessica was stunned by the revelation. She had suspected a deeper connection between Eleanor and Frank, but hearing it confirmed brought a new layer of complexity to the case. So, Eleanor's manipulation of Frank wasn't just professional, it was personal. She took advantage of his emotions, used his weaknesses, and discarded him when she no longer needed him. Simmons's voice grew quieter. Yes. And Frank, well, he was in debt to Eleanor, and Lydia had been trying to help him. But when she found out about his involvement with Eleanor, she threatened to expose them both. That's when Eleanor made sure Frank kept his mouth shut, permanently. Jessica leaned back in her chair, absorbing the full scope of the situation. The more she heard, the more clear it became that Eleanor's ambition, her desire to preserve her place in the town's social fabric, had driven her to destroy those who threatened her. First it had been Howard Trent, someone she could manipulate for her own gain. Then it was Frank Roberts, a man she could control with promises of help in exchange for his loyalty. Finally, it had been Lydia Martin, whose independent nature and tenacity had posed the ultimate threat to Eleanor's carefully constructed life. The implications were staggering. But as Jessica thought back to the first moment she'd met Eleanor, the pieces began to fit together. Eleanor's protective attitude toward Howard, her attempts to deflect attention when the truth seemed too close to the surface, her eagerness to present a perfect image, all of it had been a facade to hide the darker truth behind her actions. Later that day, Jessica stood before a small crowd in the Lancaster courthouse. The trial of Eleanor Greenfield was about to begin, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. The case had garnered attention from the local press, and people who had once admired Eleanor's community leadership were now questioning how they had been so blind to the reality of her manipulations. Jessica was not here to celebrate the fall of a person she once thought to be a respected figure. This wasn't a victory, it was a necessary reckoning. Eleanor had preyed on people's trust, and her actions had cost an innocent woman her life. As the gavel struck, signaling the beginning of the trial, Jessica felt a sense of closure. She had uncovered the truth, brought justice for Lydia, and exposed the dark forces lurking behind the seemingly perfect lives of Lancaster's elite. But Jessica knew that there was always another story, another mystery, waiting to unfold. Life, after all, was never as simple as it seemed. Eleanor's trial would unfold in the coming weeks, and though justice was on the horizon, Jessica was already thinking ahead. For now, she could rest, knowing that she had done everything in her power to uncover the truth and bring the guilty to justice. But, as always, there would be more stories to uncover, more secrets to reveal, and more mysteries to solve. Jessica Fletcher's work was never truly done.